Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Jim Starlin. He's a comic legend. Jim, welcome to Comic Culture.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite.
So let's get started with your career. You are known for writing some epic stories that are sort of a combination of superheroics and space. I guess that would be that sort of space opera. And I'm wondering what it is about the cosmic setting that is so appealing to you that you like to work in that realm.
I have to draw neither horses nor cars. But the honest answer is those kind of stories allow you to go explore things that might be related to things that are happening in everyday life, but you can sort of separate them and make it more palatable if you put them into an alien setting and sort of twist things around a bit, and you can make people think and entertain them at the same time doing that.
So it's sort of like what Roddenberry was doing with Star Trek. He would tackle some real-world issues, but put it into the context of the 25th century.
Pretty much the same kind of concept. I try to add a little bit more humor than Star Trek ever had, but that isn't hard to do.
And when you're working on these space operas, and I'm sorry if the term is negative, I'm wondering, the various concepts that you're thinking about, are you thinking that you've got this theme in mind and you just want to tell the story, or is it just, you're going to set a story or write a story and it doesn't matter what the issue is that you wish to discuss, because that'll just kind of come as you write it?
Well, a lot of it comes as I write it, but I always like to take a character whenever I'm doing a story arc of any kind on a journey. So they have a point A they start at and down E or D or C or whatever is down the line. And the fun stuff is in between and being able to see what kind of odd situations the characters can find themselves in while trying to reach that destination. It's sort of like the Joseph Campbell hero seeking out his destiny kind of thing. In this case, in some cases, it's not as grand as Campbell's, or sometimes it's more cosmic. It just depends on the story.
And you mentioned the hero's journey, and I'm wondering, when you're working with a company like DC and you're working with a property that you can't make too many big changes, you've managed to actually have big changes in your stories last for quite some time. So your footprints, your fingerprints are all across the various universes in mainstream comics, and I'm wondering how you're able to work that past your editors and say, I want to do something really big, and then have it not get reset with tomorrow, Bucky's back.
It's trickier now than it used to be. Back in the old days when I first started, Roy Thomas was the sole editor up at Marvel Comics, and he didn't have the time to micromanage every book, but they had been expanding from like 8 books to 20 some odd books over a 6-month period. So a lot of times I would just come in and say, Captain Marvel fights the Skrull this time, and you go, do it, go on. I'm busy, don't bother me. And but now there's more editors, and they feel that micromanaging is more the way to go, and so they want very complete synopsises, which I very seldom stick with when I actually get down to the story, which drives them crazy. But it's basically a little bit more controlled now and not as much fun as it used to be. The corporations are involved now. That always changes everything.
That's right. I think Ron Mars once said, you just have to return their toys the way they found them, they gave them to you in the toy box at the end of your run on a book.
Don't break them. You got to fix them before you put them back, yes. Most of the time, unless he's Captain Marvel and they don't want him fixed.
And that's true. You are known for Marvel's first graphic novel, The Death of Captain Marvel. So how does something like that come around, where they're giving you free rein to kill off this character, even though his name is sort of the name of their company?
Well, he didn't start off that way. He started off the name of Fawcett's. He was a Fawcett character to begin with that had that title. DC sued Fawcett out of business over Captain Marvel, and the copyright on it, as I understand, lapsed, and so Marvel grabbed it up before DC bought the Fawcett Captain Marvel, and that's why his book goes under the title Shazam now. The killing off of Captain Marvel started with Jim Shooter calling me up and saying, we don't know what to do with this character anymore. The sales aren't doing well. We're decided we're going to kill him off and we're going to bring him back as a woman. Okay, so I said, would you kill him off? And I worked out a deal with them. This was going to be their first graphic novel, and I worked out a deal where the third graphic novel would be my other character, Dreadstar. And so I went home, sat down, and started trying to figure out how to off Captain Marvel. And I actually typed out about 3 or 4, I can't remember at this point, different plots. They were all him dying in some heroic fashion at the end. And I kept thinking, well, this has been done before. Why would I want to spend 48 pages or whatever it is telling the same story again? And as it happened, my father had passed away from cancer, somewhere in the year before. And that just started gestating around. And as I recall, I did send a plot in. There were a number of assistant editors at that time. Most of them didn't like it. Most of them were lobbying Jim, from what I hear, to not run it. But Jim said, no, I like it. Let's go with it. And as it happens, it worked out pretty well for everybody.
And it is one of those books that we're still talking about however many years later as being a real touchstone in comics. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about something you had said earlier. You said that you'd go to Roy Thomas and you'd have an idea, and he'd say, "Go with it." As you are writing for DC in the 80s, and you are just a writer, and you're handing off scripts to Jim Aparo to draw on some of the more famous Batman stories of the 1980s. I'm wondering, are you writing a full script with panel breakdowns, or are you just giving him sort of that Marvel-style script, or how did that all work out?
Actually, I do full scripts, and probably even fuller than you're probably used to seeing. I actually include sort of a page breakdown on the panels, which, the artists are not forced to stick with. It's a suggestion, and it saves me the time of saying big panel, little panel, all that sort of thing. I'm working with Alan Davis right now on a Thanos series of graphic novels, and I'd say about 50% of the time he's vaguely close to what I put down for the panel breakdowns, but he's got his own unique style, and it just comes out beautiful looking. So why do I care if he follows my breakdowns or not? I've communicated what is needed, and he does a bang-up job all the time of realizing it.
That's interesting because, from what I know of Jim Aparo, he would, be sort of that guy who they'd give him a script and he'd give them, full inks and lettered pages, a month later. So it's interesting to see that.
1 page a day he was made. 1 page a day, inked, lettered, penciled, and then it was off.
So I guess when he's working on this book, he's got an inker, there's another letterer. So is this something where you look at the artwork and you're going to sort of revise the copy to match the art, or is it close enough to what you've done so you can just let the editor greenlight something?
To tell you the truth, I never saw his pencils until they appeared in print, because I don't live in New York City, and the editor was Denny O'Neill, I believe, and he kept everything in office. He was very tight about his control over that sort of thing, and so I would write up a script, send it in, and wouldn't see or hear much about it until it came out in print.
And you had mentioned earlier Dreadstar, which was a character that you had created. Was this something where you're holding on to the copyright and Marvel's publishing it through their Epic line, or is it something where they have the right to it for a certain amount of time and then you can go off and work on it at another publisher?
I own the copyright to it, and it has been in a number of publishers. Marvel and I split company around issue 40. We took it over to First Comics. Later on, it was at Malibu, the short-lived Malibu comic company, and now we're getting reprinted in Dynamite. Dynamite is doing the reprinting on some of these books, the early ones. So it's been around.
So as someone who's worked as an artist and as a writer, how do you make that split? I know you said that you do some breakdowns if you're writing a script, but do you ever have the urge when you're writing something for somebody else to pencil? Are you saying, well, I'd really like to get my hands on this?
No, I usually come into a job with my parameters pretty well set up ahead of time. I don't just jump in and start working that day. I sort of put stories together like you would build a building. I get the foundation and then I go up from there. When it's writing for somebody else, I don't do the complex thumbnails that I do if I'm going to draw it myself. There's little figure sketches on the side. My thumbnails for my writing are usually just little notes. The page will be broke down, and in one side it says CM hits TH, which is Captain Marvel hits Thanos or something like that. So nobody would understand my notes other than me. And then, I just sit down and I start writing it, and there's no urge to kick into somebody else's territory. I don't work that way.
And you mentioned Thanos, who is a character that I guess all of America is going to get to know a little bit better when the Infinity War comes out.
A few months.
So when you create a character and you see it appearing in other media, what sort of, obviously there's a sense of gratification because your work is appreciated, but when you see this sort of influence you have, how do you kind of balance out that whole thing in your mind?
It's tricky. When Thanos first appeared at the end of the Avengers, I only heard about it over the internet a couple days before. I didn't have any relationship with Marvel at that point whatsoever. And so I went to a midnight showing, and like everybody else, I was really surprised. In fact, the funny part about it was that at this showing, directly behind us were a number of comic book and cartoon fans. And they chatted throughout the entire movie, which was okay because it's a midnight show and you expect that kind of thing. But when Thanos showed up in the end credits, all of a sudden all of the comic book fans went, "That's Thanos!" And all the cartoon fans went, "Who's Thanos?" So I listened to the debate while the credits continued to race on. It's kind of funny. It never occurred to me when I started off that two of my most popular creations would be a bad guy and a glove. If somebody had told me that at that point, I might have stayed with working on cars for a living. But, I guess it's worked out okay. I have no complaints, really.
It's interesting because the Infinity Stones have become such a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I would imagine it's just got to be enjoyable knowing that you've had that influence. And I know that over at DC, you had the influence with the death of Robin, and I showed the comic a moment ago, the Death in the Family story arc that you wrote. So I know you probably told the story a number of times, but who comes up with the idea, let's kill Robin, or at least have the contest where the writer, or the viewers rather, are going to call in and decide if he lives or dies?
The call-in was Denny O'Neil's idea, but 6 months before I had started writing Batman, and I always thought that if you're going to go off and fight crime, and you're dressed up in grays and blacks, but you have a teenage partner who you send out in primary colors, well, that goes beyond child abuse. That's just plain child endangerment. So whenever I wrote the Batman stories, I kind of left Robin out for the most part until Denny finally said, "Hey, you got to do a Robin story." Which turned out okay because at the end we leave the question open whether Robin has murdered somebody or not. He was included in the cult book, and when we let's see how I could cut this down to a shorter story. Basically, DC had this idea that they were going to give one of their characters AIDS because this was just the beginning of the AIDS breakout. And they actually put up a box in the office that you were supposed to drop suggestions into which character. I stuffed it with Robin, of course. I wanted to get rid of him. They realized this and they threw him out. And what ended up happening was that Jimmy Olsen got elected to get AIDS. But then they found out that the actor who played Jimmy Olsen in the the George, not the George Reeves, Steve Reeves, Christopher Reeves Superman books was gay. So that idea got scrapped and they never did anything with it. But then Denny came up with the call in an idea and called me up and said, "How would you really like to kill off Robin for real?" And I said, and he started telling me it, and we got the story together, and I did up the 2-page alternate endings, and the book went out. The fans voted him to death, and then afterwards, very shortly afterwards, DC's licensing department realized they had all these lunch boxes and pajamas with Robin's picture on it. So I suddenly became the bad guy up there, and within a few months, all my work dried up. I was gone. I sold their best-selling book that year, and I was gone. But it worked out okay. I went over and did the Infinity Gauntlet afterwards at Marvel.
You know, you talk about the Infinity Gauntlet. That started off with George Perez doing the pencils, and I wanted to talk about your art style a little bit because you, in your I guess your debut at Marvel, your style is different from Kirby, from Ditko, from Gil Kane. It's got a lot
influenced by all of those guys, though.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering, as you're putting this artwork together, if you could just talk about your process a little bit. Are you, you know, obviously back then you're using pencils and ink and all that other stuff. As you moved on, have you changed your approach at all in terms of either the figure or the tools that you're using?
My process to art has changed constantly ever since I started on it. I started off working on a little laptop on sofas and just drawing directly onto the page. As time went on, I learned tricks that other cartoonists used and incorporated them into my work. I wanted to become more of an illustrator. I've always been disappointed in my own artwork. I always wanted to have more of an illustrative edge to it than it actually has. But I'm lazy and I've never put in the effort to actually achieve it for any period of time. I've had a few little spells when I was doing illustrations for a novel called Pawns that I was really quite happy with. But most of the time working in comics, you have these deadlines and you just can't put the time in to really do the masterpieces that you have floating around in your head. And so a lot of times I just had to get things out, and looking back, there are pages and pages that I wish had never been seen the light of day. There's a number of them I like, but you know, there's an awful lot of them I wish I could buy back and hide away in the closet somewhere.
Well, I mean, from what I've seen, your work is expressive and detailed, and you tell a great story. So I'm wondering, as you're looking at, you know, storytelling, the idea of breaking things down and I guess the character acting, how much of that is, you know, planned, and how much of that just kind of comes out as you're drawing something?
Well, it's all planned in the breakdown stage. Storytelling's my strong suit. That I don't have a lot of competition on. The artwork, there's plenty that's better artists than I am. But storytelling has always been my strong suit. I've always worked it out. I've been inspired by films, other cartoonists, just reading. Everything in life has been an inspiration as far as I was concerned on how you would tell a tale. And like I said, I like to make the characters take a journey, and it has to be an emotional trip. So planning out how those feelings and actions are planned are pretty well charted out before I ever sit down at the drawing board.
One of the problems that I know that I have when I'm drawing, I've got a page on my drawing board right now, and I've got a character who's reflecting about his actions, and he feels a little guilty about it. And I'm having a hard time working that out. So I'm wondering, you have complex emotions in your very complicated stories. So are you in front of the mirror trying to, like, sort of Norman Rockwell out the way a person might stand if they're feeling guilty, or are you looking in, you know, at film stills trying to work that out, or is it just something where you can, you know, because you've seen enough that you can kind of sketch that sort of real life drama on the page without too much effort?
Some of all of the above, and throw in grabbing a digital camera and taking pictures of yourself to act as your own model. You know, photos from out of magazines, images you see on television, they all tell you a little bit more about how you should tell a story. I mean, everything's an inspiration. Um, it comes down to what the requirements are and then figuring out what's the best way of getting to that point. Um, like if someone's really emotionally distraught, I'll sit down there with the digital camera and collapse on the floor with the timer on and shoot out a half a dozen shots of trying to act the emotion out. One of the things I did learn from Stan Lee is there was a period where I was working with him on designing covers for other artists to actually pencil when I first started off at Marvel. And I would bring the sketches in, and Stan would always go, "Terrific, terrific, but." And then he would actually get up on the desk and he would act. He was a frustrated actor. He wanted to be an actor as a kid, and his uncle sort of pushed him into this publishing business. But it always stuck with him. And I would watch Stan act out these ways he wanted the Silver Surfer to be posed, and he was a great lesson on that, if nothing else. My studio's falling apart even as we talk.
It's fascinating because it's something that I guess people reading the comic wouldn't necessarily fixate on. They just kind of read that story. So it's good to see that Stan was thinking about the overall impact and that he was passing that knowledge on to you, and now hopefully we're passing that on to someone who's watching the show. I did want to talk a little bit about your new novel, Lasgood's Boys. If you could tell us a little bit about its origin. I know it's on Amazon right now, but if you could tell us a little bit about the process you had. I guess it's something that could have been a great comic, but you chose to make it a traditional prose novel.
Well, it was originally going to slated to be an illustrated novel. I did lots of drawings for this project, and then I blew a big hole in my hand, and I don't draw anymore because of that. I'm good for about a half an hour at the drawing board, and then it cramps up on me. So I'm strictly a writer these days, and I pulled all the drawings from Lasgood's Boys and Mind Games, which is the prequel to Lasgood's Boys, which is also currently on Amazon. It's going to be a quartet of novels by the time it's done. I'm working on the last 20 pages of the first draft of the third novel at this point. It's just on the other side of the studio, actually, sitting on the screen. But Lasgood's Boys, the first one, Mind Game, is about a telepath who's what's called a teletherapist, who in his past life he was part of a crime family on a satellite called Hardcore Station, which old comic book fans will recognize as something I did over at DC back in the 80s also. Lasgood's Boys is about aliens have come to Earth, and they make better mousetraps than anybody else does. And so before long, they're running the show. They start with North Korea and build out from there. And after a while, everyone's enslaved to the Omni Ever Corporation, which is run by a group of executives who are not very fondly referred to as the weeds, because they're a vegetable life form, an intelligent vegetable life form. And this one industrial leader in South Korea, I believe it was, decides that the only way to get rid of the weeds and save Earth being used up like Omni Ever has done in all its other planets is to up the humanity's game. And so he gets a geneticist and hires him to create a son for him. Unfortunately, the geneticist has his own agenda, and he creates 3 boys instead. And a smuggler, Mackie, is hired to haul these boys off from a lab hidden away in Mexico and brought to different people in the United States. And the first 2, the Korean industrialists and these Anglican preachers get their kids, and the third one, his parents are grabbed before the child can be delivered, and Mackie, the smuggler, ends up raising the kid. And these three boys grow to adulthood in the story. And the whole question is rather, are they going to kill each other off first before they do humanity any good? And it looks more like the former than the latter up until, the climax of the story.
And I've got to say, I've read the book. I was on a cross-country flight, and that was a great way for me to enjoy 5 hours in coach, because it's a richly written book. It's very, you can find yourself pulled into that world pretty easily. So I'm wondering, as you're writing the words, how is that different than you drawing those images?
A lot more words. It's the same movie running in my head that runs in my head when I'm writing a comic. The story's visual. I'm allowed to have the characters talk more deeply than it would be in a comic book. I don't have anybody pulling references to Trump out of my stories this way. It's more freeing. It's a longer process. You live with a novel for a long time, a good year for most of these things. And at least in my case, I'm not Stephen King. I can't get them out like that. But I've come to enjoy it, and I think that's going to be my full-time occupation at this point, is just writing the novels occasionally, and only occasionally doing some comic book work here and there. I'm doing some work with Ominous Press right now. We got an art book coming out around the time of the movie and little projects like that. But for the most part, I'm going to sort of focus on the novels.
Well, Jim, I'm being told that we are out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for talking with us today. And I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We'll see you again soon.